before I start, though, I want to say my group is bipartisan, and we do not take political positions, and we don't endorse political candidates. But that doesn't prohibit us from noting when elected officials take bold courses of action in the public interest. And State Representative Naomi Jacobson should get a lot of support for taking the bold position that we need to fix tax policy, make it fair, ensure everyone pays their fair share, and staking a political career on that. So it's not frequent we get elected officials that are willing to step to the plate on this issue, and I think we should applaud those who do. And I am Ralph Martire, and I am Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, and that just means that my board of directors doesn't really like or trust each other very much. And that's a really good thing, because we have very different ideological views on our board, but they hang them at the side and say, we will, irrespective of our worldview, support a data-based, evidence-based approach to making public policy better in the great state of Illinois. Now, unfortunately, that's not the way the political debate is handled most of the time, so I really appreciate my board members for being willing to support us because we take on these tough issues. One of my board members is here. I'd like to introduce Marlise Trover in the back. Marlise, if you'll wave. And she's also affiliated, I believe, with Eastern Illinois, with the Educational Leadership Program. I'm going to try to take what's going on in Illinois and put it in context, because I think one of the real problems with fixing tax policy is it's dealt with in a silo. And what folks don't understand is how tax policy very much impacts everything we do care about that state government does. So this is a chart that I love and most people hate, but it's loaded with numbers, which is why I love it. It is the general fund budget that was passed for the current fiscal year, the one that we're living in right now, 2014. You look at the very top line there, that's total expenditures for the year, $35 billion in our general fund. What you will hear people say is Illinois has a spending, not a revenue problem. We shouldn't look at tax policy for a solution. We should look at bringing spending under control. It's really spending that has driven our deficits and our real problems in this state. There are no data that support that contention. So that $35.7 billion is $179 million more than last year's general fund budget. But it's not spending on services that's gone up. That second bullet point you see, hard costs, it's basically non-discretionary spending on two things: debt service, whether owed to the pensions or owed to outside creditors, and the local government distributive fund, the money the state shares by law with local governments. That, this year, has increased by over $800 million from last year's budget. So if the total expenditures are only up $179, but your debt service and your hard costs are up by more than that, what's happening to your spending on services? It's going down. And that's precisely what's been happening in Illinois. You get down to this bullet, that's what the state is actually going to appropriate to core services this year. And you can see I've listed them: healthcare, pre-K through 12 education, higher ed, human services, public safety, etc. Then my favorite line in your budget, Naomi, they always have it every year, the unspent appropriations line. That means there's $500 million of these appropriations they know they're not going to spend because they don't have enough money to do it. They just haven't decided what's being cut yet. So if you are in higher education or K-12 or early childhood or human services and you have a line in the budget that's an appropriated expenditure for you, you may not get it. It's really the maximum possible appropriation you could get. As the budget year wears out, decisions will be made on what will and will not get funded. So the bottom line is, our total expenditure on those core service areas is going to be only $24 billion out of the $35 billion spent. The rest is primarily hard costs, debt service, and transfers to local government. This is how that spending compares to last year, and you can see a couple of areas got a nominal dollar increase across the board, and a couple of areas were cut. But we continue to struggle with a deficit in Illinois, and the fact that we are cutting service areas from one year to the next, the fact that we have a deficit accumulated in the core service part of the budget is really a matter of concern for every voter and taxpayer in Illinois because of how that money is spent. Who has heard state government needs to fix its priorities in order to solve these problems? Have you heard that? Show of hands, priorities. Okay. This goes back almost 40 years. Illinois state government has spent its general fund money on 4 things. 9 out of $10 go to education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Which of those is the poor priority we need to reevaluate? 9 out of $10 goes to education, health, social services, and public safety. That's our service budget. It's unbelievable that people can say these represent poor priorities. In fact, poll after poll indicate that voters and taxpayers very much expect state government to continue to provide these services and provide them at a very robust level. A funny poll done by the Senator Paul Simon Institute at Southern Illinois University asked us generally as voters, hey, the state's got this big budget problem, what should it do to solve it? Should it raise taxes or should it cut spending? And about 58% of the state who were saying said, cut spending, don't raise taxes. More than half. A greater percentage across the board, though, said, don't cut education, 68%. Don't cut health care, 65%. Don't cut social services, again, 65%. And don't cut public safety, 65%. More people decided they wanted none of these services cut, yet that's 9 out of $10 we spent. So when you've got a budget problem in Illinois and cuts have to be made, understand those cuts go to education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. That's where there's discretion on the spending side. That's where the entire deficit has to be balanced. Now, I would support, as a staffer at a bipartisan organization, significant cuts in spending if in fact there were any truth to the contention that spending on services was driving our ongoing deficit problems in Illinois. There's just no truth to that. This compares state spending current fiscal year as enacted in the 2014 budget to what it was in the year 2000. The first bar makes it look like that blue bar, the 15.5%, makes it look as if we're going to spend about 15% more on those 4 core services this year than in 2000. But that's just a nominal dollar comparison. No adjustment for inflation, no adjustment for population changes. In other words, it's a meaningless comparison. And it's the kind of comparison used by the people that don't want to go to tax policy as a solution. That's how they can claim spending is up. Not looking at inflation, not looking at population changes. The middle bar takes 2014 expenditures on services and adjusts it for inflation and population growth and then compares it to the year 2000. The second you adjust for inflation, and in the middle bar we use the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, spending scheduled for this year will be 23% less in real terms than in the year 2000 on education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Now, the Consumer Price Index is really a great inflation metric for the economy as a whole, but for that very reason, it's not the best inflation metric for public sector spending. I mean, the economy as a whole includes things like Pop-Tarts and Twinkies and hair care products. And state government doesn't buy a lot of, Pop-Tarts or Twinkies, or since Blagojevich has been gone, hair care products. What state government buys is labor. Think about those public services the state funds. Education, health, social services, public safety. Every one of them is labor intensive. And approximately 80 to 85% of the state's budget is in fact the wages or the salaries of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers who actually deliver these services in our communities. So there is an inflation metric that's tied to the cost of labor over time, the employment cost index. Using that more accurate inflation metric and doing the same evaluation, we could purchase with our expenditures for 2014, 28% less in services than what our expenditures could purchase in the year 2000. That is a dramatic, real cut in spending on services. And it's not just an inflation-adjusted cut if you look at more recent budget cycles. From the year 2009 through the year 2014, in nominal, non-inflation adjusted dollars, our aggregate spending on those four core services will be $4.7 billion less this year than in 2009. Education, health, social services, and public safety in nominal dollars, without accounting for inflation, have been cut by $4.7 billion just since the year 2009. Now, I wanted you to get a feeling for it's an across-the-board cut. So this is an inflation-adjusted look at every one of the key lines, pre-K through 12 education, higher ed on down, 2014 compared to 2000. And what you can see is across the board it's a cut. Pre-K through 12 will be $800 million less this year after inflation than it was in 2000, a 10% cut. Higher ed, not that anyone in this room cares about higher ed, but higher ed, 40% cut. A lot of this is a legacy of the Blagojevich administration. I don't know if you recall, but the first few years of the Blagojevich administration, some very meaty cuts were made to the higher ed approach. They have never been made up for since those cuts were first installed, but we're continuing to cut higher ed. Even healthcare, which everyone complains about, we're going to spend 19% less on healthcare this year, and that includes Medicaid, than we did in the year 2000 after you adjust for inflation. So these cuts have been across the board in Illinois, and they've been to every service area. So I want to deal with some of those arguments that come up against changing tax policy to add revenue on a more fair and sustainable basis to fund services. They say, well, spending has been driving our cost up. No, it hasn't. And we need to enact some cuts before we can even talk about taxes. We've enacted cuts. The state of Illinois has very much scaled back its investment in the core services we expect and demand and should expect and demand. And it's time that we start looking at the other side of the ledger to see what role tax policy has played in creating our difficult fiscal condition. Now, a lot of noise is made about this temporary tax increase and how, in fact, I just did a debate with the Illinois Policy Institute where they said, you know, we passed this temporary tax increase, we raised about $7 billion, $8 billion in new revenue, and nothing's changed. It hasn't helped at all. It's, you know, services are still being done, all this rhetoric. Our state deficit for 2011, 12, 13, and 14 is the green bar up there. You see it varies from 9.1 billion to 8.9 billion over that sequence, right? That has been our accumulated state deficit in the general fund. So if you think about that, got an $8 to $9 billion deficit. We only spend $24 billion on services. Our deficit's about 36%. That's a pretty big deficit, and it's in those four core service areas. But that includes the revenue that we've raised from the temporary tax increase. So we just reran the numbers and took out the new revenue from that temporary tax increase. Gee, what would Illinois' fiscal condition look like? Making those same cuts to services, $4.7 billion in nominal dollars over the last 5 years alone, et cetera, the state's actually done. Without that revenue, last year, our deficit would have been $25 billion. Our entire services budget was $24 billion. This year, the deficit would be $34 billion. Our entire general fund, including our debt service, pension payments, and local government payments, is $35 billion. Without that temporary tax increase, I can tell you the cuts to services would have been far more dramatic than what you've seen. And that temporary tax increase is the only thing keeping the wheels on right now. Now, the good news about that temporary tax increase is it raised some significant revenue the state really needed to maintain its investment levels in services. The bad news, twofold, it goes away real soon, and it added no fairness to the tax system. It got us some revenue, but it didn't make tax policy any fairer for taxpayers or people. So I think that graphic illustration tells a pretty strong story. Now I know Representative Jacobson has heard this, but I want to hear who else has heard this sort of rhetoric. So who has heard an elected official say, or a candidate for office say, I will never support a job-killing tax increase? Show of hands. Everybody heard that? That is brilliant political rhetoric. Because I have never seen a candidate run for office as the anti-jobs candidate. Oh, you elect me, I am going to crush the economy and have jobs run. No. Everybody, jobs good, right? Voters, jobs good. And the other brilliant part about that rhetoric is it fits on a bumper sticker and it fits on a mailer. So if you have a state rep or a state senate race, you could just mail that in to the district if your opponent in the race happens to be for some sort of revenue enhancement, and boom, well, I don't want to kill jobs. The problem with that rhetoric is, like the complaints levied against the spending side of the ledger, the data don't support it. So now we're going to use numbers that my organization really didn't create. They are based on the work of a guy named Mark Zandi. Do y'all know who Zandi is? He's the top economist at Moody's.com, the bond rating agency. So he's a bond rating economist, PhD. And he's no liberal, just in case you think he's some lefty economist out there. No. When Republican Senator John McCain ran for the presidency a few years back against Barack Obama, Zandi was McCain's principal economic advisor. He's a Republican, moderately conservative PhD economist working at a bond rating agency. He looked at the impact different fiscal actions government can take, cutting taxes, raising taxes, cutting spending, etc., in response to a recession, and how it impacts job growth in the private sector. And he looked at actual historic data, what really happened in the past, given these different things government has in its toolkit to choose from. And then he created a multiplier, said, well, for every spending cut of $1, X amount happens to the private sector for every tax increase, whatever. What he found was very interesting. States that raised taxes the right way, fairly, progressively, shifting tax burden to top folks over the bottom and middle, and maintained or increased their spending, did a much better job growing their private sector economy than those states that cut spending in an attempt to balance the budget in response to the recession. In fact, he found for every dollar state government spent from taxes it had raised to maintain, the private sector got $1.31 of economic activity. That's a very strong multiplier. Now, why would that be? And it's common sense. What is our economy? Y'all know, right? It's consumer spending. 68 to 70% of all economic activity at the state level, at the federal level, are folks like you and me buying junk and such. That is the economy. So next time somebody talks about the job creators, grab a mirror, look at it, you're the job creator. People spending their wages. What did we just say a couple of slides ago state government actually spends its money on? Wages! It's the wages of the teachers and the correctional officers and the social workers and the healthcare providers. It's 80 to 85% of the state general fund spending on services. So when state government cuts its spending on services, it's cutting wages, meaning people have less to spend in the consumer economy. So for every cut, you lose $1.31 of economic activity. Illinois' got a $9 billion deficit. If we were to cut $9 billion in spending out of our general fund right now, using Mark Zandi's multipliers applied to the Illinois economy, we would lose $128 100,000 jobs in our private sector. But if we raised taxes the right way and maintained that spending, we save those jobs. If we grow that spending, we grow those jobs in the private sector. So while it was great political rhetoric for an elected official or a candidate to say, I will never support a job-killing tax increase, it happens to be 180 degrees from reality, based on the work of Republican economist Mark Zandi, who works for Moody's. All right. And some data that seems to indicate Zandi's analysis was spot on. This is percentage growth in state GDP for the first year following the Great Recession, the first year of recovery. Now you remember the Great Recession ended officially in June 2009. It may not feel for many people like the Great Recession has in fact ended, but it did end officially by economic statistics in June of 2009. So that makes calendar year 2010 the first year of recovery following the Great Recession. Note that that is a full year before the state's temporary tax increase went into place here in Illinois. The two states that did the worst growing their economies coming out of the Great Recession in the Midwest were Illinois and Missouri. Now I'm going to ask you a question, kind of to see if you're still awake. Which two states do you think had the absolute lowest combined state and local tax burden in the Midwest during this year, 2010? You're correct. I'm going to give you the data. First, my source. There's no secret modeling here. This is straight out of the Federation of Tax Administrators. All they do is take the consolidated audited financial reports and post the data. They don't model, they do something we at CTDA like to call math. They do math. So in this case, what they did was they said, let's look at all state tax revenue, all local government tax revenue, all state and local fee revenue for every state. Divide it by personal income and see what the tax burden in that state really is. Illinois, 42nd in the nation in tax burden in 2010. Missouri, 47th. So our much higher tax neighbors did a much better job growing their private sector economies in the first full year following the recession. Why would that be? It's because their revenue systems are better than ours, so they didn't have to eviscerate public sector spending as much as we did, and hence didn't harm their private sector economy as much as Illinois and Missouri did. The data are right there to look at. Now, we did raise taxes the very next year, and we've done some math to look at where we went to. We call it kind of meatball math because we took the tax increase from 2012 and stuck it back in 2010. So it's a little bit of a fantasy, and it overstates the impact of the tax increase. And Illinois jumped way up from 42nd in the nation to total state and local tax burden to 35th, bottom 15. We did not become Taxachusetts, okay? So all these people that try to claim Illinois is this high-tax state and blah, 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 they aren't looking at the real data, or they are consciously choosing to ignore it. So then, I think before you get into resolving your tax policy, now we understand sort of what the state spends its money on, that its priorities are good. We understand the deficit is significant. We understand spending hasn't driven it. We now know that simply raising taxes doesn't destroy jobs. In fact, it could very much help keep them. We know all that stuff. Let's put everything in context of the state's economy. Overall, Illinois is relatively big and rich. We have the 5th largest economy of any state in the nation, over $670 billion economy. In fact, if we were an independent country, we would have the 19th largest economy in the world. It's a larger economy than Saudi Arabia and Ireland and Greece and Norway, some places you might have actually heard of. That said, for a long period of time, Illinois' economic growth on a percentage basis has lagged the much higher tax remaining U.S. So we're lower taxed than most other states in the nation. We have a large economy to begin with. We have a lot of natural advantages. We have a financial center in Chicago. We have a couple of transportation hubs here and downstate, etc. We have 9 world-class universities. We're in one of them now. We have a number of great advantages. And we've been incredibly low tax. Yet, our economic growth has lagged the higher tax rest of the nation. Something's not working. I'm going to argue that part of what's not working from an economic growth standpoint is how we fund our schools, and that is very much tied to our poor tax policy. So I don't know if you follow K-12 funding, but we start off with something called the foundation level. That's a minimum expense per kid, set by law by the General Assembly every year. Now our foundation level in Illinois doesn't include a lot of things. It doesn't include the cost of special education or poverty or transportation. There are a lot of things that aren't in it. It's really supposed to be just the basic cost of educating a child. What goes in the classroom, teacher salary, textbooks, technology, that kind of thing. Back under the administration of Governor Edgar, an organization was appointed called EFAB, Education Funding Advisory Board. EFAB's job was to take the foundation level that we have in Illinois and actually tie it to a standard. The standard they picked was, gee, what would it really cost per child to buy an education of sufficient quality so that we can expect 2/3 of our non-at-risk children to pass our state tests. And run by that standard again. It's the cost of getting 2/3 of the non-at-risk kids passing tests. So the first thing, it's not enough money, the EFAB recommended foundation level. It's not enough money to educate all of our kids. It throws 1/3 of them out the window to begin with. Actually, it throws more than that out. Because remember, I said it's 2/3 of the non-at-risk kids. At-risk kids who come from poverty or have special needs or are English language learners, those are the technical populations that comprise the at-risk population overall. We never bother to figure out what it will cost to educate them. So we throw all those kids under the bus. So now we're talking about the cost per child of purchasing an education of sufficient quality so that 2/3 of our children with a reasonable likelihood of academic success will be passing tests. That's our standard in Illinois, the EFAB standard. Back in the year 2003, the actual foundation level per child in Illinois was $120 less than the EFAB recommendation per kid. We have over 2 million children in our school systems. By 2014, the current year, our actual foundation level has grown to be $2,500 less per child than the EFAB recommendation, which is that pretty tight, narrow cost of getting 2/3 of the non-at-risk kids passing tests. I argue that's an insufficient amount of education funding. You can give me the counterpoint, I'm willing to listen. Doesn't look good. And the brilliant thing about, and by the way, it's actually worse than this says. Because for the last 2 years now, this year and last year, we haven't even funded our full stated foundation level. So our stated foundation level in Illinois is $6,100 per kid. It should be over $8,000 per kid. And we're only going to fund it at 88%. So 88% of the 6,100, that's going to be the foundation level this year. So not even, this is the sort of Pollyanna picture. Now, the brilliant thing about our woefully underfunded education system at the state level, starting from this low point, is that once they've set this foundation level, then the state of Illinois doesn't bother to pay for it. In fact, it pushes most of the obligation for funding the foundation level onto local property taxes. Here's the national data. In Illinois, Illinois is in the red. You go to the far right. Illinois pays for 27% of the cost of K-12 education from state-based resources. The national average is for a state to cover 46% of the cost. The feds cover 9 to 10. Which means in Illinois, local governments pay 60% of the cost of public education, see as property taxes, whereas the national averages for local school districts only have to cover 43%. In case you're wondering, Illinois ranks 50th in the country in the portion of education funding paid for by the state. So obviously, this has created quite a significant property tax burden for people in Illinois. And I want to give you some numbers on that. This is, and we've taken out the impact of inflation, so this is in real terms. From 1990 to 2005, property taxes after inflation in Illinois grew by 48%. Median income grew by 2.7. Property taxes, median income. From 2005 to 2011, the last year that there's full property tax data available, property taxes grew another 8%, median income declined by 9%. So you've got a property tax burden growing in Illinois at about 20 times the rate of growth in income for most people during most times. That's not a real fair way to tax people. If you think about it from an education policy standpoint, what does that do? It ties the quality of the public education we can give a kid to the affluence of the community in which the kid lives. If a kid lives in a property wealthy community in Illinois, they have a world-class education. I know this, by the way. I'm on the school board in River Forest. I'm an elected official. I'm on my school board. I don't know why they elected me, but they did. And we are a national blue ribbon school. We also, I think, have a zoning ordinance against poverty. There is no poverty in River Forest, Illinois. And virtually every dollar we spend on public education goes directly to educating our children. And if you're wondering, we're at about $14,000 per child. The state's foundation level is $6,100. We have over 90% of our kids meeting or exceeding state standards. After this adjustment, even, we're at 88%. But I said I was going to tie our lack of investment in public education to the economy, and the data here are compelling, and I think a lot of you know this data already. But for the longest time, there's been a growing correlation between educational attainment and economic viability in the private sector. We know that, for instance, unemployment rates very much correlate to educational level. Right? The higher your level of education, the lower your unemployment rate. This slide shows that very clearly. This is less than high school unemployment rates set across the board for the nation, the Midwest, and then Illinois. And you can see high school grad, how those unemployment rates drop, and then some college drop again, and then bachelor's degree or more. I guess the only exception to that is art history majors, and no one can help them. But the bottom line is there's this very strong correlation between educational attainment and even being employable in the modern economy. What's new is the statistically significant correlation between educational attainment and wage. The time when you could just sort of graduate high school and get you a good job, the kind of job that'll put a car or two in your garage and a kid or two through college, is over. Since 1980, the only cohort of workers in Illinois and America that have seen their incomes increase at a rate greater than inflation, that means real growth in purchasing power, have a college degree. Every other worker is earning less today than in 1980. So you really got to learn to earn. Then there's the wage data on gaps between, bless you, again, I'll go for 3.
Generally, I do 3.
Then there's the wage data on gaps between majority and minority workers in Illinois. And what we've seen is that the wage gap between whites and Latinos has grown in Illinois by 46%. See that red number there over the end? From 1980 until 2010. That's the last year we have wage data that's accurate enough to do this analysis. Now that's a pretty big growth in the wage gap. But I could explain some of it, at least, by neutral labor market forces at play. Because with Latinos, you happen to have a significant immigrant population that's willing to take low-paying jobs. You have English as a second language issues. And as a demographic, Latinos happen to be both the youngest and least educated ethnic division within our labor force. Being young and being uneducated are both indicia of being qualified for only a lower-paying job. So those neutral labor market forces explain some of the growth in the wage gap between whites and Latinos. Not all, but some. Then there's the growth in the wage gap between whites and blacks of 92% over this same sequence. Now, as far as neutral labor market forces here, I've got nothing. All right, so there are only really 2 things happening. Thing number 1, discrimination still impacts labor markets. And it doesn't really matter how you slice this data, and I'll give you a couple of quick examples. You see racially disparate outcomes. And so the hardest to employ people, if you went back to my last slide, are folks without a high school diploma, right? Overall, the unemployment rates there are very high. Just before the Great Recession, the unemployment rate for whites in Illinois who did not have a high school diploma was 11%. It's a pretty high unemployment rate. The unemployment rate for blacks without a high school diploma was 27%. Then you flip that and you go to BA or higher, the most credentialed people in the workforce. That's pretty much the ticket to being higher paid. In fact, 57% of the whites with a BA or greater are in the highest 5% of income earners. Only 22% of the blacks. So once again, it doesn't matter how you slice that data and try to compare like kinds, you see racially disparate outcomes. But it's not just discrimination. It's also the way we fund schools. So let's get back to all the data I just threw on the table. We over-rely on local property taxes to fund schools. That has created a highly inequitable system. In fact, Illinois always ranks as either the single most inequitable or second most inequitable education funding system in the nation. We have a very inequitable system. And only those kids who live in more affluent communities with high-end property wealth, or are lucky enough to have a nuclear facility nearby or something like that, have well-funded public educations in our state. 55% of our African American children attend the 5% of school districts with the greatest poverty and the lowest property values, and have the least spent on their education. 93% of our African American kids and 66% of our Latino kids attend school districts where the concentrated poverty level is 30% or greater. Poverty becomes a major obstacle to educating a child at 25%. Property values go down significantly at 20%. The net result of that, the way we finance school, over relying on the local property tax, has been historically these minority school districts that educate our African American and our Latino kids start off with about $1,500 less per kid per school year, K through 12, to spend on education, and have for decades. And our starting point for education is woefully inadequate. And these kids are starting out with even less. And if you segregate out a portion of your population for a particularly woefully funded education for decades, the kids coming out of those schools will not have the numeracy literacy skills they need to go on and credential themselves at the next level, so they won't. And that will show up in your wage data, and it has. So something that should have nothing to do with access to opportunity in a modern economy, something like tax policy, in Illinois is standing in the way of us providing an adequate education to children when education matters more than ever to being competitive in a global economy. So now that we know all that about Illinois, let's get to fixing tax policy, because I think that might be why some of you actually came. These are the 4 principles economists agree upon that you need to have a tax system that will work in a modern capitalist economy. Now that's an amazing thing to say, right? I've heard if you took all the economists in the world and you laid them up end to end, you still wouldn't reach a conclusion. Have you heard that? But here, oh come on, this crowd should love that humor. That's special for you. All right.
Where are the economists?
Yeah, maybe we didn't invite anything. So, to have a fair tax system, and this isn't my normative value, this is actually textbook fiscal policy. So if you bought a textbook on how to design tax system for state or local government, it would say these things. We have cites to some textbooks if you want them later. You need a fair tax system, which does mean progressive in a capitalist economy. You need one that's responsive to where the economy is going. I thought brilliantly said by Naomi Jacobson when she said, Jesse James or whoever the criminal was, rob banks because that's where the money is. Well, yeah, that's what you have to do. You have to have your taxes grow where the economy is growing. If you focus your taxes where the economy is sinking, I went to Indiana University undergrad, but we would say there is that doggone hum. You need stable tax revenue that'll be there even during a poor economic cycle. Now think about this, is a very important feature of tax policy for state government, because during a recession, what happens to the demand for public services? Does it go down or go up? It goes down. I mean, it goes up, rather. But your revenues are going down. So you have a unique situation. This is something the private sector never faces. Demand for your services are jumping, and your revenue's going down. In the private sector, every time demand is going up for what a business is selling, whether it's a service or a good, their revenues are going up with it. So you uniquely have to ensure you have this nice stable revenue source, and then an efficient tax system. Illinois, sadly, is 0 for 4. That doesn't work, and that creates this. This is the structural deficit, and this is why we don't fund our pensions. This is why we have a deficit. It's got nothing to do with our spending policy. It's got everything to do with our tax policy. All we did, and this has been peer-reviewed by the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, and it's also been peer-reviewed by a PhD economist named Max Sawicki, who's the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C. So this has been peer-reviewed. All we did was then look. Let's assume the state honestly balanced its budget in 2013. It did not. It had a $9 billion deficit, but as you can tell from my presentation, I'm kind of an upbeat Pollyanna guy myself. So let's assume it was actually balanced. Would it stay that way if there were no changes in law? Just assume inflation and population growth and a normal economy. Would our budget stay balanced? The blue bar shows you the cost of maintaining services and paying our current debt that's on the books. The red bar is what our revenues will generate. The gap between revenue growth and service cost growth is our structural deficit. A couple of interesting things to note here. That's the phase out of the temporary tax increase. So ever envious of poor policy elsewhere, Illinois thought the federal government should not be the only place with a fiscal cliff. We created our own, and that's that phase out of the temporary tax increase. And so you notice it will cause us to lose significant revenue by 2016. We are in 2014. But the more important thing is look at the slopes of the two bars. See how this one's a lot flatter than the blue bar? So even if that temporary tax increase was maintained, we'd still have a structural deficit. That's the green bar. The green bar shows you how our revenue system will behave if we just keep that flat 5% rate. You'll note revenues won't grow with our costs, and we'll have a deficit, and it's significant. It'll get worse over time. And that's because our tax policy doesn't work in a modern economy, and we need to fix tax policy or we can't solve the problem. Cutting won't solve it. Let's assume 2020 is a gubernatorial year. Let's assume in 2020 we elect Oberweis, governor of Illinois. Yeah, look, we elected Rod twice, we could do it. He says, I'm going to cut spending right down to revenue. Pick your revenue line. Let's just go down to green. So he does. The very next year, the rate of growth in our cost line will be greater than the rate of growth in our revenue line. And the very next year, we'll have a deficit. Because at a minimum, our cost grows with the economy. But because our tax system doesn't match the economy, our revenues do not. That's the problem. So this problem has been going on in Illinois since at least the late 70s. That's the first time, I think it was the University of Illinois did a study showing that there was a structural deficit here. And so, since politicians didn't want to deal with tax policy, what they decided to do was to paper over this structural deficit with debt. They wanted to borrow money. They wanted to borrow money for a long time, but they had to find an easy source. And what they chose was the pension system. Because that's really debt the state owes to itself, in a way, right? It's both lender and borrower. So they just didn't fund pensions, send an IOU to the pension systems, and took the revenue that they should have put in the pensions, and instead used it to pay for services, to paper over that structural deficit. In 1994, our unfunded liability in Illinois had grown to $17 billion. It probably doesn't sound like a lot right now to you people, but we were only 54% funded then, one of the worst funded systems in the country. By the way, that $17 billion in debt was twice what our state owed those pension systems from just 5 years earlier. So in 5 years, we doubled our unfunded liability. We were borrowing against the pensions that aggressively. So then, we passed, in 1995, the pension ramp law that you're all familiar with under Governor Edgar. And under this law, they said we got to stop this borrowing and we got to, in fact, pay it back. So they said, let's pick a period of time. Let's pick 50 years. So by the year 2045, 50 years from 1995, if we make the payments that this new debt repayment schedule we're pushing on the state requires to be made by law, and they set it all by statute, then in the year 2045, our 5 pension systems will be 90% funded across the board. Now they passed that. Think about what this did. They took our cost bar, and they said, now we've got this debt repayment vehicle, we're calling the pension ramp. It's just debt. It's not pension, it's debt. We owe the pension system. We're going to move that up. Now we've got to make these payments. And they didn't pass a nickel of revenue to fund it. So who thought that might work? And the answer is no one in the General Assembly at that time. And in fact, by law, the pension ramp continued the practice of underfunding the pensions and diverting revenue to the general fund to pay for services for 15 years. By law, the unfunded liability was grown from that $17 billion figure to $45 billion in 2008. That was our responsible funding law. And we all know what happened in 2008. The Great Recession. Kaboom, financial markets. We lost a bunch of investments we already made. Then, of course, we decided to reevaluate a lot of the actuarial principles looking at our pension systems. I mean, frankly, you public employees keep living longer than we want you to. Other things were changing in the economy, so they changed some assumptions for the pension system, and we magically went from $45 billion to $95 billion underfunded overnight. So far to point. how much have I said benefits contributed to the growth of this unfunded liability? Have you heard me mention that? Yes or no? No? You know why? Because benefits aren't the problem. This is from COGFA, you know, the Good Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability. State's own numbers. These are the dollar values attributed to different factors that grew our unfunded liability from 1996 to 2012. This is the last year there's data for it. The blue factors are the ones that are inherent to the pension systems themselves. Changes in assumptions, people living longer, benefit increases, salary increases, everything that actually contributed to the unfunded liability that's due to the pension systems themselves. If those were our only problems, today our systems, which are only 40% funded, would be about 76% funded. There'd be no crisis. We'd be able to get to the healthy 80% in a 30-year window using actuarial sound principles with no sweat. The green bar is the Great Recession. $15 billion. That's a lot of money to lose. Even that, coupled with the unfunded liability, we'd be north of 65% funded. That's not great, but we could still probably deal with it. Look at that big red bar. That $32 billion is the additional borrowings by law of underfunding that we diverted to other purposes. It's a debt problem. It is not a benefit problem. It's not even a Great Recession problem. And these are the state's own numbers, and they know this. This is the brilliant pension ramp. This is how backloaded the payments are. Look how they jump from year to year to year to year. Anybody here have a mortgage? Anybody? Mortgage? Everybody have one at one point? You guys have all paid off your mortgages. Yeah, lucky you. I eat a lot of bologna. Do any of your mortgages have magic jumps every year in how much you have to pay? Or is it a flat dollar amount? It's a flat dollar, isn't it? Why? Because you and your bank are sane. What you did was you sat down at the time of your loan and said, all right, you're going to pay this back over 30 years. Let's figure out how much you could afford this year. And that's how much you're going to pay every year to pay it off. And you're both betting that that's then going to be doable. Because if you could afford it in year one, after inflation, it's a diminishing obligation to you in year two. Hopefully you get a raise. So over time, if you could afford it in year one, you should be able to afford it over the life of your loan. In our case, the state of Illinois sat down with itself. So there wasn't a lot of excess sanity in the room. And it said, how do we design our repayment structure so that we being politicians in 1995, don't have to deal with this problem, and we can kick it down the road to somebody else? This was the answer. No one ever thought the state would make these payments. You can't, I'm pretty good with tax policy. I can't design tax revenue to jump like that every year. Just can't do it. So it was always intended that this repayment schedule would be thrown out at some point and the state would re-amortize its debt. That's not one of the options on the table right now. I do want to show you how much debt is driving this problem. Our total contributions to the pension systems are set out here in the top line. 4.8 billion, 5.8 billion, 6.7 billion, fiscal years 12 to 14. So you can see those jumps in payments, right? This is under current law. But the normal cost, that's the benefit cost to the employer, the state of Illinois, for funding benefits, that doesn't jump. It remains relatively constant at 1.6 billion. The debt service under the pension ramp, repaying the past due debt, 3.2 billion, 4.1 billion, 5.1 billion. All the growth in that pension ramp is debt service. None of it is benefit related. Yet all the solutions on the table are benefit related. This is why that won't work. The red bar is current policy. That's the current ramp. The blue bar is pretty much Senate President Fullerton and the governor's benefit cut package. You note that it saves some money, but it doesn't remove the debt service. The green bar is that package of the governor and the Senate President pretty much, and a shift of the normal cost for schools to local school districts. You still don't solve the problem because it's not benefits that solve the problem. You save some money, but you still have an unaffordable, unpayable amortization schedule. The only way to solve that is to re-amortize the debt. We've actually figured out a way to do that. We've run this by the state's actuaries, and they say it works, and this will cover debt service. So the blue bar is current law, the red bar is what CTBA suggests. This cuts zero benefits. It flattens out the payments. It does extend the payment period, what you don't see, for about 13 years after 2044. But even though it extends the payment period beyond the current payment period, the state still ends up paying a couple of $1 billion less overall. So it saves the state money, and it's affordable, it's constitutional. There you go.
Didn't you discuss that in the news earlier this year or late last fall?
Yeah. Yes. So now fixing taxes. So the first thing we've got to do to fix our fiscal condition is to re-amortize that pension debt. We need to do three things. The second thing we have to do is to bring some stability to our tax system by expanding our sales tax base to include consumer services. Here's the chart for that. What our sales tax applies to is pretty much the sale of goods, hard physical things you can touch, Martire, this podium, whatever, goods, not services. Of the 46 states in America that have a broad general sales tax, because ours is only limited to goods, we have the fourth most narrow base. We don't tax most of what's happening in the consumer economy. That's a problem. That's unstable. The way you have stable revenue is to have a broad base for your sales tax. Here's some of the numbers on why our current sales tax won't work. In 1965, goods, the red bar, represented 32% of all economic activity in Illinois. Services, this is what we don't tax, 36%. Go to 2012. What we do tax goods has declined from 32% to 17% of our state's economy. What we don't tax services has jumped up to 73. Questions? I mean, obviously you can't leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy out of your tax base and expect to balance your budget. And in case you're wondering about our neighboring states, all of our neighboring states tax services more than us. Every single one of them, including Missouri, which is a lower tax state than us overall. So Missouri, Kentucky, and Indiana tax anywhere from 25 to about 45, 50% of the services CTBA thinks should be taxed. Iowa and Wisconsin tax all of them, have since the 70s. Have you seen busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming in here to get their haircuts? Or, you know, no, they tax those things there, we don't here. Now, if you've seen their haircuts in Iowa and Wisconsin, they should probably come. But they're not doing it for taxes. But even more important to taxpayers, I think, is making our system fair. And the only way, or the best way to do that, is to pass Naomi Jacobson's resolution in the House and the Senate and create a constitution that permits a graduated rate structure where the rate can get higher at higher levels of income. And on this one, I don't want you to believe me either. I am going to read from my PowerPoint, which is a no-no. You have not seen me do that, but I'm going to do that here because it's important. This is a quote out of The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776 by one Adam Smith. You all know Adam, he invented capitalism. That Adam. According to Adam Smith, if you have a capitalist economy like he suggests you have, then the subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Homelord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That is not Karl Marx. It's not even Groucho Marx. It's Adam Smith. Now, just to show you how far removed from real capitalism the critiques of doing this from a tax fairness standpoint have become, I debate the Illinois Policy Institute. They use the same quote from Adam, but they stop it here. And what they say is, what he really was trying to tell us was a flat tax. And that meant in proportion to ability. Flat tax for everyone. They leave this part out. I mean, that's just how undata-based the whole argument is against doing the kinds of things that Representative Jacobson and Senator Harmon have put on the table for us. There's nothing to support it, even in capitalist theory. Now, why did Adam Smith think taxes ought to be progressive, ought to be fair, ought to equate to ability to pay in a capitalist economy? He theorized, that if you have a capitalist economy, economic growth will always disproportionately advantage upper income classes over everyone else. And he felt that there were a lot of reasons for that, differentiation and bargaining power and blah, blah, blah. So he said, so if the top income classes are always going to benefit disproportionately, and he did use that word, from this system, then they should have the greatest tax burden as a percentage of income to pay for the government that ultimately ends up lining their pockets. Was Adam right? Right, so this is from the research of Professors Piketty and Sayers, and what they took was Internal Revenue Service data, straight out of the tax returns filed by Americans. And they looked at who shared in income growth over time. From 1947 to 1979, after inflation, the wealthiest 10% took home 34% of all growth in income in America, leaving 65% for the bottom 90%. Things have changed. I mean, still a disproportionate return to the top. From 1979 through 2011, the wealthiest 10% after inflation had 139% of all income growth in America. How much is all of it? 100%. They got more than all the income growth in the nation. Meaning 90% of the country, on average, 39% less today than in 80. So to be fair, you want to focus your taxes up here, where people are paying it out of their growing wealth, right? You don't want to focus taxes down here, where people are, in fact, according to the data, paying it out of their growing poverty. Flat tax ignores this. In fact, Illinois ignores this. This is tax burden as a percentage of income by income class in the state of Illinois. You see that the poorest 20% in Illinois pay over 13.8% of their income in state and local taxes. The top 1%, 4.9%. This is taxable income.
This includes sales tax?
Yes, this includes sales tax, property tax, every other kind of tax. So obviously we've got it all wrong. And the best way to fix this, or one of the best ways to fix this, at least from a fairness standpoint, is to have the Constitution permit a graduated rate structure. And that's why we need to pass this amendment. And you really do need to work on your local legislators to come in and support Representative Jacobson and to support Senator Harmon and to really move this through. This should be good bipartisan policy. Because ultimately, amending the Constitution is up to us on tax policy. So when you go sell this to your local elected official, if they are against it, and a lot of people are going to be worried about it, you could say, who are you to deny me the right to vote on how I want to be taxed? I don't care if you're liberal or conservative. Your voting to allow this to come to me is simply letting me decide as your constituent how I want to be taxed. Are you afraid of me? I think that that's an argument that's hard to overcome. So voting for it doesn't even mean you support it. It means as an elected official, you support allowing your constituents to decide whether they want to be taxed fairly or not. We've also run, I think Representative Jacobson has a very interesting approach to this, and what's great about having a graduated rate structure is you could do it in a number of different ways. You could design a number of different changes to the tax code to adjust tax policy. In our case, we did a slightly different than Representative Jacobson, but once again, similar outcomes, where income tax payments were literally reduced for 94% of the tax filers in Illinois, increased at only the wealthiest 6%. And so taxable income, you see, it'd be taxable income of $150,000 or less would on average receive income tax reduction. Remember, taxable income is after all your credits and deductions and blah, blah, blah. So this is not a gross income figure. And I'm going to end with, okay, so all the arguments at the end of the day against this come down to one thing, and it's usually economics. And it's usually if you go to a graduated rate structure, you will harm your state's economy. I hope I've given you enough data to know that that's really a specious argument. It doesn't hold water, it's not supported by any data. But there is a really interesting study done by the Institute of Tax and Economic Policy, and they looked at the 41 states in America that have an income tax. There's only 41, 9 do not. And then they cherry picked. They looked at the 9 states with an income tax that had the very highest marginal income tax rate structures. The Californias, the New Yorks, the New Jerseys, very high tax rates. And then they compared economic growth over the last decade in those 9 states with the highest income taxes in the nation versus the 9 states, the Floridas, the Texas, and whatever, that have no income tax at all. Here's what they found. Their high income tax states had better growth in state GDP per capita than the no tax states, better change in median wage, and identical unemployment rates. There is no statistical correlation between being low tax and economically competitive at the state level. None. And anyone who tries to make that case is full of it. So the bottom line here is clear. Illinois has a fiscal system that simply doesn't work in a modern economy. It is shortchanging core services. It is frustrating the state's ability to invest in really important things that do drive long-term economic growth, like public education and infrastructure. It's frustrating our ability to take care of the most vulnerable members of our society. And it's all because we're afraid of fixing tax policy. My organization has sort of determined, looking at all this stuff, that we need, let's say, about $4 billion more in new revenue to actually solve our deficit. It would still take a couple of years to pay the whole thing off, and then start enhancing education funding to the point where every child in Illinois receives a meaningful educational opportunity in their school. That's the cost. It's about $4 billion more. $4 billion was a lot of money when I was a kid. Illinois has a $671 billion economy. That would be taking less than 1% of the economic activity in our state in taxes and devoting it to these core services. That's what's standing in our way. Less than 1% of our economy. Really? It's time for us to just face facts here. We do have a tax policy problem, we do have an unfair system, and we need to reform taxes to make them work. They need to be more fair, they need to be more stable, and if we did that, we will have the opportunity to create a better tomorrow. So thank you. And I will take any questions if